So hello everyone, and welcome to another conversation of the third cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. And today I'm very glad and honored to introduce Milton Shinberg. Milton Shinberg, AIA, has been a practicing architect for 50 years. He joined the faculty of the Catholic University of America School of Architecture in 1978, has taught all studio levels and his seminar, Beauty and Brains, since 2004. His investigations, excuse me, we have a guest here. His investigations, writings, and lectures focus on connections between empathy, affect, and architectural neuroscience, including design applications. He has made presentations to national audiences in the USA and international venues, most recently for NAD in Venice. He is active in the Academy for Neuroscience for Architecture. Milton, thank you so much for accepting this invitation.
Happy to be here. Happy to be with all of you. I'm going to start it, but before I do, I'd just like to say that I think the best learning outcome probably would happen if you interrupt me. If something doesn't make sense or you have a question, so we can do Q&A at the end. And you'll notice in my way of presenting that I do seem to, move from one thing to the next, but I'm happy to be interrupted. So please do that. I think that'll make for a better time today.
Okay, so we extend this you also to the students. I think that's what you meant, Milton.
Yes.
Okay, so this is for you. So when you want to make questions, just jump in. Okay, let's go ahead.
Okay, so today I want to talk about three things. It's really more like 3.5 things. Essence, emotions, and permeability, and I'll spend some time talking about what each of those actually means in the context of this talk. The half thing ultimately may be the most important thing, which is, see, I'm not sharing, there we go. The most important thing, I believe, is how you take the subject today and convert it into a design process. So I will get to that at the end. That'll be the punchline. It's not advancing. It's advancing. Okay, so that's what I was just saying about asking. So I'm going to speak as an architect. And my reason for studying this subject matter is that I feel like it has enhanced my design work, as well as certainly having something I can share and teach. So I'm speaking as an architect in the language of design, but also science, art, and music. And I'm fortunate to have some background in each of those, and those coalesce in this subject nicely. So I'm not going to talk as a neuroscientist as much as I love neuroscience, and I've studied it since 1980 in its relationship to architecture. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I am somebody who has a lot of experience in studying it and studying it richly. So a little bit about my background, not going to give you a long history here, but just to say that my earliest interest was in drawing and then piano music. But then I became very interested in medicine and science as a result of meeting someone who was inspiring and got me interested in scientific thinking and specifically biology and medicine. And then writing, something I enjoy quite a bit. And then architecture. Architecture was a slightly later interest of mine. I think I was probably 16 or 17 years old and working construction and during my summers, and I got hooked. And then I got involved with teaching because I think architects have a mentor gene. I think we tend to want to share and teach, and most recently painting. So where does all this go? Why am I telling you all this? And the reason is that we're going to talk about essence. And I think essence has a lot to do with how things come together. Architects and a lot of people in the arts are what I call, not what I call, are called polyglots, people who have different interests, and they're there, they're present. You may say you're designing a building, but in your mind, there are other things going on. So let's start with essence. What is it? Well, what about its characteristics? The first is that it's omnipresent. Essence is what you experience in the world. It's the way your brain takes things in. It starts with what is the essence. The first processing is to find out what the target of cognition is. It's not reductive, and this is very significant. Essence is really a enveloping almost like a cloak around you in the way you relate to the world and you see it. And it's difficult to break it down into pieces without losing the whole. And that's a major theme for the talk today. An example of that is qualia. There's something that can't be subdivided further, can't be analyzed beyond its redness. So that's considered a qualia. And I think essence and qualia are strongly related. It's inclusive. So if I look at an environment, I say, I don't want to pay attention to the street lights, I don't want to pay attention to that. Well, your brain will do some editing, but it starts with a very inclusive sense. And there's singleness. What do I mean by that? Ultimately, when your brain processes things, it can only do one thing at a time. I could show you examples of images where you would claim that you can see two figures, you can reach cognitive closure in illusions, particularly there's one called the rabbit and duck illusion. And in that, you could, you may think you can actually see two at the same time, but you can't. So we have a conundrum, and that's where this talk is going. How do we create the whole while we manipulate the parts? And that's what architects and designers do. We manipulate the parts. It's hard to do, but it's essential. So some examples. Essence is the quality that can't be taken away. It's the relationship that can't be taken away. It's the tone and the feeling that can't be taken away. This wonderful building by Peter Zumthor. And in this case, Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. It's the relationship to nature that can't be taken away. If you take that away, there is nothing that is significant. So that's the test of essence. If you take something away, does it fall apart? So one way to think about this is dominant qualities. What does that mean? Well, for example, a dominant quality might be verticality. And that may be the most important or the most impression granting affordances of the environment in a case like this, or it could be horizontality. I want you to start thinking in kind of a gut level way in your embodied sense of the world, what these dominant qualities are in terms of how they feel. Because ultimately, this starts with an embodied process. Smoothness could be a dominant quality. I don't know what this form is. I couldn't describe the form to you if we were on a telephone and I had to say what it is. Roughness, I could describe. Okay. And then there's some that are a little more complex that have to do with gesture. So the older Greek temple on the left is the weight is pushing down. It's a bodily experience. And I think a word for that could be perspiring. And just to be overly clever about it, I would say the Parthenon lifts upwards toward the heavens, and it's inspiring. Other ones, you could say calm. You could say energetic. Here's an example of background buildings, which I'm saying are recessive. That's a word just to describe that. Or in the case of the one on the right, which is actually not the same row of buildings, but it looks like it, assertive. So that's a foreground building as opposed to a background building. It can be dominating, as the bird's nest in Beijing is, but it could also be contributing, as is the case in this ensemble. And that's an important word. I want you to focus on that as a word as we go through. Okay, so what's the dominant quality of a particular building? Well, what are the derivations of it? I think affinities helps you understand it. And an affinity is something I'll get to with unfooling later on. How do you relate to what's out there? How do you feel a connection? Empathically, what is the thing that matters the most? It could be an affinity with the setting, as it is with Falling Water by Wright. It could be affinity with purpose, or it could be affinity with affect or emotion, as Zumthor's work always is, and Botha also, of course. But it's also affinity with culture or style. Let's say it this way: what do you gravitate toward? Identify that in yourself. You'll find out that if you're explicit about it, if you can be self-conscious about it, it'll help you understand the path that you're on. Nothing's right or wrong. So what does the brain do? The processing that takes place in your brain is to find essence for survival reasons, to find out what's the most important information that's out there. So your brain doesn't tolerate incompletion. It doesn't tolerate not reaching the whole. Then it looks at the parts, but the first part of the process is the whole. So there's a term that I'm sure you're familiar with, Gestalt, which has to do with the whole and essence. So what is the Gestalt of something is what we say? Well, it's the cognition of wholeness. That's the way I'm going to define it for this discussion. And Gestalt is insistent on cognitive closure. I don't know if you're familiar with the use of that term, but cognitive closure means that sensation comes in, your brain starts to process it on a perceptual level, then it goes to the cognitive areas of the brain, starting maybe with the visual cortex or the frontal lobe, depending on what kind of experience it is. And then your brain says, I've got it. Cognition means cogno, comes from cogno, the Latin for I know. It's a conclusion. And Gestalt is the process the brain has for survival to reach closure. It completes the incomplete. This is really true in architecture. If I design a form that isn't quite resolved, or to say it another way, I purposely leave something out, your brain will complete the form. So you don't always have to fully state your architectural intention. It's a survival necessity because the speed of reaching cognitive closure is what allows us to say, that's a saber-toothed tiger, or that's a food source, and to respond appropriately. Here's some examples. There's no black triangle, but there is a black triangle in your brain. There's no white triangle, but there is in your brain, and those black circles are complete in your brain, but in fact, they're not. Okay. And three-dimensional forms can also be processed by the brain, even though there's some complexity in this and there's some contradiction in this. Nonetheless, your brain is very well designed to reach closure. So what about essence? Can it be measured? Here we get to the issue of what does science do? What can science do? What does science have a hard time doing? But we shouldn't rule out that science can do some things, because there are clever neuroscientists who are constantly looking at this. So there's a wonderful quote from Louis Kahn. You may have heard it a few times, but I'm going to repeat it anyway. A great building must begin with the immeasurable. That's an idea. It has to go through measurable means when it's being designed. What are the dimensions? What are the components? How do these materials relate to each other? And in the end, when it's lived, when it's experienced, it must be unmeasured, because that's how it reaches you. Buildings reach you on an emotional level. So the creative process is much better when it aims at the immeasurable, but the scientific process is better when it aims toward the measurable. So here we have a divergence, which is really important in studying neuroscience and architecture, something to talk about. So can it be measured without losing the essence? Well, that's the challenge. It's a challenge for neuroscience more than it is for architecture, because we do deal with the whole more than we deal with the parts at the conceptual level. So here's some neuroscientists who are looking at architecture. Some of these folks have talked, or you've heard them before or heard of them. These two in particular, Samir Zeki is really the granddaddy of aesthetic cognition, and Anjan Chatterjee very much involved with aesthetics as well. Looking at aesthetics as scientists and seeing how it works, but also seeing what the survival benefits are. So for science, this is the contrast I'm going to create here. The whole is typically the sum of its parts. You assemble it, it is reductive, you can take all the pieces, you put them together, and you get a whole. Okay, because it's empirical, it has to be replicable, and it's reductive. But we experience the whole. We don't experience the parts so much. Aristotle nailed it for architects. He said, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. This creates a serious challenge for us as architects in terms of how we design, because we have parts. How do we get the whole? Well, the whole experience is similar to the musical experience of timbre. Raise your hand if you know that term, if you've heard the term timbre before. Anybody? Okay, timbre is the wholeness of an experience. Let's see if I can activate this. You just heard a fragment of a chamber music work, and that little fragment is a part of the unfolding of one idea that unfolds through the course of time in which the music takes place. Architecture does the same thing, but I want you to stick with music right now. What I'd like you to do, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do is this. I want you to listen in your own mind right now. Take a moment to the first music that you think of. Just let it play in your head. Your auditory nerve has an incredibly rich array of input and output lines that are able to take in so many characteristics, but it sends a signal that is coherent to the brain. And that's what memory has. It has those pieces assembled into a whole that's richer than the sum of its parts. I'm sure that you all heard music in your head. When you think of timbre, spelled T-I-M-B-R-E, timbre is the pronunciation. Think about architecture as being something that has timbre. So you can't isolate just one part of the experience without losing the essence in architecture too. So if Aristotle was here with us in Stuttgart today, he would raise questions for architects and neuroscientists, and we're going to pursue those. Is there a research framework that embraces both the whole and the parts of environmental experience without losing the timbre? Well, so far, not much. That hasn't been achieved. And one of the frustrations, I think, in the dialogue between architects and neuroscientists is how elusive it is to do that. But there are some opportunities. There's something called a narrative method, which is considered valid for information gathering by scientists. So for example, I could ask Karina or Anna, tell me about the place where you live. And you would say, it is such and such a place. And I'd say, no, don't tell me how many windows it's got. Tell me how it feels. And you would start you would be forcing yourself to go through a transition in your mind between imagery and feeling and words. And I can capture that by recording what you say. And in doing that, I find out what matters to you the most, because the things that you remember are the things that matter to you. I've had my students go into a coffee shop, and then we leave, and then I surprise them and say, now I want you to draw the coffee shop and plan elevation section and a perspective thumbnail sketch. And what they draw is incomplete in literal terms, but I tell them each one is completely accurate. Okay, so let's see what we can do with the parts and the essence. The architectural researchers, and there are plenty, mostly we begin with intuition, which is something you've got tons of. You've had decades to develop your intuition. Where does it come from? Instinct, that's what you're born with. Feeling, which you're also born with, but becomes more resolved as time goes on. And what we call a hunch, a suspicion about what's true. Here's a great quote from the movie maker, Frank Capra. A hunch is creativity trying to tell you something. Next time you're stumped in a design problem, remember this quote: a hunch is creativity trying to tell you something. Adolf Loos, a wonderful architect, said this, and this is a great quote for us: architecture arouses sentiments in man. Sentiments are something you perceive with your intuition and your emotion. The architect's task, therefore, is to make those sentiments more precise. That means we can't be unconscious about things. We have to dissect them and understand them. So the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture that you heard about had a conference called Beyond Intuition. And here's neuroscientists and architects really fighting it out, trying to find out who knows what about what. But their whole job is to make those sentiments more precise. That's what architects do, and that's what neuroscientists are trying to do too. So here we have a bunch of architects, some of whom you're aware of and know and have seen, and we are pursuing it. In 1957, Richard Neutra was pursuing it by looking at certain questions and finding certain answers. Here's two authors in 1977. And then alarmingly, in 1989, Dana Cuff and Russell Ellis had to write a book called Architects' People to tell architects, you're not thinking about people at all. You don't understand people. How can you design buildings without understanding your clients? This had to be said in the strongest words. And you've heard Harry Francis Malgrave, that's taking us jumping up to 2018. And Peter Zumthor, 2022. And then Juhani Pallasmaa, we know, who has written so many things over so many years, all of which are questions and answers. Let's talk about emotions. I keep saying that emotions have a lot to do with how you perceive the environment. Well, let's look at a little bit more about that. I'm going to posit to you, I'm going to say that they are the fuel for essence. How you feel about something is the line, it's the cable, it's the rope between you and the essence of something. It's the primary driver of architectural experience. I've been doing this stuff, teaching it and making buildings now for a long time. I know now through all this experience, talking to other people who use my buildings and other buildings, that it is the primary driver. It happens first. It's the seen and felt presence of emotion, which is another definition for affect, the seen and felt presence of emotions. Antonio Damasio in 1999 writes, the feeling of what happens. The feeling of what happens. Now I'm going to show you an example that I'm sure Maria will like with some words for affect. What does the Mona Lisa feel? Well, we don't know, but I'm going to conjecture that she feels serene, pensive, and gentle, and then what has mystified everyone, secretly happy, but we don't know about what. Emotional design is actually a field. It's often applied to product design, and the people who want to make money with products are very good at understanding how to design for emotion, because people who want something enough will pay for it. If they love something, they'll pay more. So this is something that happens in product design, but it also happens in architecture. So here's a test. This is for everybody to do. You don't have to write anything down, but this is called the love it or hate it test. Here are 3 images. Look at each of them very quickly and just say in your own mind silently, do you love it or hate it? It may be something in between, but tilt one way or the other. Do you love it more or do you hate it more? Try these. Try this one. The question of why is one that we could spend many lectures on, but let's start with what. Then I'm going to make an assertion, which is that sometimes there is the null reaction, which is don't care. You may care about this image. It's personal to some extent, of course. I'm putting it in here because I found this one to be null, that is not connecting emotionally. Okay, so now permeability. This is an image of the brain that shows, it's a representation, it's not an actual image of the brain, but it gives the idea about 1 million connections in the brain. So what's permeability? Why am I talking about that? Because I think permeability is how you experience the world. It's a way of understanding architectural experience, not as something static, but as something that's shifting and layered and very interactive. It's dynamic between us and what I'm going to describe as a porous world. What do I mean by porous? Think to yourself of what that means. It's supposed to mean something that is permeable to outside influences. So for example, I have a screen here in my window, but it's permeable in that I can see out my window and I can see trees and sunlight and a few cars and houses across the way. So those are ways that you get that information and it permeates into you. Okay. But we also permeate within us. People who study brain functions know that there's a lot of things happening in a very short period of time from what's outside of us. It aims at architectural design and it connects us to human needs and capacities. If you talk about permeability of experience, you can't help but be talking about people. Why do we want to talk about it? Because we want to create more humane environments.
Milton, here I would just make an interruption with the comments that this idea of permeability also connects to the idea of neurogenesis, of the capacity of the brain to create new connections, exactly by being permeable to link with different people, different knowledge, different experiences.
That's exactly right. So brain plasticity is how permeation really is activating in time. I'll talk a little bit more about the time factor. So what's a perm? We don't need to get into this too technically, but it means a differential pressure on two sides of a membrane. For humans, the membrane is your skin, but we know that lots of things happen outside of our skin that feels like it's part of us, and things that are happening within our skin that feel that we know are part of us. And there's this continuous back and forth across your skin. You know, sometimes things look like they're impermeable and opaque, but that just means we haven't looked deep enough at the molecular level. In cognitive terms, things are permeable even when they don't seem to be. Now, these differential pressures occur moment by moment by moment. Okay, you've got all the senses, neurological receptors, but we don't just look at the world, we look through and in between the parts of the world that our cognitive systems, and this is important, chooses to see. We have an agenda. What do we need for survival? We go back and forth between perception and cognition. So what are the permeable senses? Well, I'm sorry, what I meant to say was that the senses are permeable in that you're reaching out visually, you're reaching out with touch, and in each case, information from the outside is permeating into you, and that's what the senses are for. And then there's permeable cognition, where different parts of the brain do different things in order to reach cognitive closure. Permeable embodiment, absolutely. When you touch, it's an outside to inside thing, but it's also inside to outside. When you reach for something, you're permeating from purpose to experience. Permeable culture, we know that we're enmeshed in culture and it changes, it swims around us all the time. Permeable memory, very much the case that you don't always remember what actually happened because it permeates in the brain and the brain chooses to remember certain things and not other things. So it flows in both directions. What's the accomplishment of this? Why do we care? Because the tapestry of experience is unbelievably rich. You've got billions of nerves, you've got trillions of interconnections in your brain of the nerves that are residing there. It creates an incredibly rich tapestry. Well, what's the need for that? Why do we, the tapestry isn't just there to say, look, I have a beautiful tapestry that I'm connecting to. Anticipation, inspiration, and integration, these are survival mechanisms. All of these things that we do with our brain aren't just to experience, it's really to trigger action. Looking at a beautiful sunset's wonderful, but we don't know, we can say what the beautiful sunset is telling us about the weather that night and the weather the next day. So here's a problem with the models. I'm sure you've studied it this way and I want to challenge it. The model is typically outside to inside, and I'm going to call that the projective model. Here's an image of it. There are a bunch of buildings. The buildings have things that have forces that come to our senses and they go into our brain. Well, that's passive, but perception and cognition are dynamic and very interactive. So it's not passive. At the very least, it's two-directional. But with permeability in mind, it is multi-dimensional. So information and activation, they just go back and forth constantly from moment to moment, processing each saccade. And I don't know whether you use that term or not, but it's a glance. It's one capture that the eye makes that the brain processes. And then you go on like that to the next one. So the brain is constantly editing out, excuse me, what's not important, what's not the essence. And it's at the same time invoking memories. So there's a collision between what you already know and the information that's coming from the outside. And at that interface that happens in the brain, that's when you say, aha, I get it. And I'll say that's what meaning is. Meaning is that collision between memory and experience of the moment. Here's a nice little phrase that I love. What fires together, wires together. So if you keep looking at certain kinds of trees because you love those trees or you love those flowers, they will become stronger memories reinforced in your mind. Okay, so now let's look at the deep permeability with the environment. We're going to do that through the term empathy, and that's inherently a directional model. So I think it's better than the reactive model. It's not passive. It's constantly going back and forth. Empathy, what is it? A couple of definitions. Why don't you read this one? Read this one. And read this one, which I think is the most important one. So Einfühlung, which I'm pronouncing, I'm sure, not very well, goes deeper than empathy. Empathy is the connection to what's outside in an emotional way, which is inherently a perceptual and cognitive way. You can't separate emotions out from those. So we're all connected. We all have a connection to what's in front of us, and it's so much of a driving force that little kids want to touch paintings, and painters want their subjects to emerge out into the environment. The way we experience the world actually might be more like the experience for a Wi-Fi array, a network, which has signals coming from lots of different places. So it's a visceral, physical response. When I look at a beautiful scene, I feel it. And where does it reside? In the brain. We're going to talk about the brain a little bit. It resides in exactly the same place that architectural memories are formed, the limbic system. If you're familiar with the limbic system at all, raise your hand. Anybody? Okay, the limbic system is deep in the brain. It is the ancient brain, sometimes called the reptilian brain, because it's reactive, highly emotional. It has to do with orientation in space. And I'm going to posit that in modern people, it's the seedbed of meaning deep in our brain. Without the limbic system, which is a regulating system, we wouldn't have art or architecture. So what does it do? It conveys, it's involved with emotion, memory, spatial orientation, navigation, and pleasure. Pleasure is particularly significant because pleasure is evolution's way of saying, do this again. And the things that it says to do again are the things that promote survival. The limbic system does that by triggering hormonal expression. And some of those hormones are very pleasant, like dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins. And those are the ones that help us connect to things that are particularly good for survival, like food, like sex, like beauty. There's also physical permeability, which is what people usually talk about when they talk about permeability, as opposed to this process of mental engagement and empathy. But it's important to look at it in architecture. Think about permeability as turning a dial, tuning the scene to how much transparency you want in your design and how much opacity you want in your design. In my firm, we've done projects where we don't want to have glass, we want to capture the shadow. So it's a different kind of permeability. Sitting on a terrace, sitting on a balcony is inherently about permeability. It's reaching out into the environment. Okay. So here's an example. In this project we did in DC, in Washington, we turned the dial of permeability to have some containment on the inside, but also some seeing outward. We did that with the density of these fins and the colors of them. And those were each design decisions. So we were trying to get the sense of the whole by manipulating the parts. Okay. Here's another one where we went to some trouble to cut a stone in half to make a sense of connection. And this one is an example of a Foster and Partners project in England for a health center for people who are trying to survive cancer and the biophilic connection. Permeability is rampant in this image, but so is it in places like the Barcelona Pavilion, where the permeability is taking place over time, or in the case again of Frank Lloyd Wright, the connection to the outside. So let's go back to Aristotle, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. let's try to understand that by looking at essence with permeability over time. Think of it as a formula. Permeability times time equals essence. It also equals cubism. I want to talk about cubism not because this is a talk about painting, but because it's about architecture. Cubism and architectural experience are permeability through time. We experience different parts of what we're looking at all the time. We're constantly seeing different facets, but not in the same moment cognitively. Each moment differs. So let's call that multiple exposures, like a camera, that overcome something that's unreal. Thinking that we see the world as discrete views is unreal. What we really see in our mind is a composite, combining multiple views, just like architectural memory and timbre works. It's also not so new. Here's an example in a medieval church, stained glass. You can see it, multiple views of a face, different kinds of meaning. But the classic example is 20th century cubism, where something is broken apart and put back together again to make the parts come together so the whole is greater than the sum of those parts. It's also not so new. These are cave paintings. This is 25,000-year-old work. Look at the depiction of these lions moving across time. It's not static. This really is not just fact, but expression. So from your cubistic architectural memory, I want you to look at an image. I'm going to flash it really quickly, and you have to decide whether you know, not decide, you have to figure out whether you know what it is or not. I'll give you another look. Unmute and tell me what you saw. Anybody recognize that? That word means recognize. Raise your hand if you get it. And Maria, I can't see everybody. Did anybody get it?
I think nobody back there. Did you get it?
Now look at it a little bit longer.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, I think it's a tower from the not above, the opposite of above.
Tower from below.
From below.
But do you recognize which one? Did you?
No.
Oh,
that
okay.
was just my.
Your impression.
Yeah,
yeah. I would very briefly have guessed it would be the Eiffel Tower, but I think not. Now looking longer.
It is.
It is.
Yes.
I was lucky.
So we see the Eiffel Tower like this sometimes. I took this picture when I visited the first time. We see it like this, but people walk toward it. They look up. They see it like this. This and this formally are quite different in terms of the organization that makes an impression on your brain. So really, we know the Eiffel Tower cubistically. That's how it's in our mind. Not just this view, not just this view, not just this view, but the whole of it. Okay. So I'll give you a metaphor. That architecture is like dance. I know this will appeal to Maria, and I hope to the rest of you. It involves permeability and time. So here is a sketch by a music composer, and you can see that there are no notes. This is all about choreographing the musical experience over time without losing the essence. So the parts are being manipulated, but just like timbre and music, the whole remains greater than the sum of the parts. We can do the same thing with architecture. I have my students choreograph experiences first by experiencing something that is out in the world, and they go out and diagram it, but then in their own design projects to decide what the right choreography is. Here's the Barcelona Pavilion. This is a diagram of how people move through it. Here's a drawing by Le Corbusier of the structured dance of the Parthenon. That's how you see it. That's how you approach it. It's not static. So there's architectural choreography, and it's an attempt to achieve the experience of the whole. Here's something that Maria and I and some other folks are working on. It's to come up with a dance performance at the Salk Institute. Why are we doing that? Because the space resonates with motion. It resonates over time with the forces of movement that take place. Well, this is a very strong example, but all of architecture is that, not just having dancers at SOC. So there's some diagrams we're using just to illustrate what could happen as a plan of the main courtyard with different dancers coming out from different places. So I'm just going to summarize so we have time for some conversation. Experience is immersive and unified, call that principle 1. As architects, we can design to make the whole greater than the sum of the parts, principle 2. And we can do it by thinking about the progenitors, the things that generate our design work. So here's one. I talked about dominant qualities. Let's split it into 3 parts. Dominant meaning, memory, emotive, linguistic, metaphoric, and choreographic. That's where the meaning side of things is. If you're working on a project and you'd say, what are the aspects of this project that do fit with those categories? It generates questions. Now you're not designing yet. No pencil has touched the paper yet. This is a thinking process. Next, the dominant purpose. Intention. In Vitruvian terms, that's commodity or hierarchy. And then dominant qualities in an experiential way, spatiality, embodied, haptic, formal, different intensities, and Gestalt, all take you to that red dot in the center, which is the essence. So what do you do with all this? Well, I don't know if you use the term pre-design or programming to describe the process of analysis and the process of starting to generate ideas without trying to get the whole thing, but to generate ideas about aspects of things. That's pre-design. And if you do this, as you work through this, your brain does a lot of work for you. You don't have to force this. You will find the primary design drivers emerging naturally as you think these things through. This is kind of a checklist. And checklists can be very boring. But I think if you use this kind of listing of things, you're going to find out it's not boring at all. It really is quite good. And use words. If you're talking about metaphor, that's inherently, well, there can be visual metaphors, but it can also be words. If you're thinking about intention, you can write, the intention of this space is, and just give it a few words, like the Mona Lisa had a couple of words. Doesn't take a lot of words to differentiate your intentions for this project from intentions that would apply to many other projects. Okay, it's an analytical process, it's an intuitive process. Trust your intuitions, trust your gut. Seek essence in the ensemble, that it's not just a bunch of things, it has a wholeness to it. So here's what I propose, that you seek essence through pre-design, and that instigates design effortlessly. Sometimes people think design is a very tough process. If you do a good job with pre-design, it's actually lighter and more, it's richer, and it happens faster. So it's getting that pencil on the paper too early is a problem. So in design, we integrate purpose, affect, cognition, empathy, and meaning for a purpose to create a fully permeable experience. And that brings us into essence. Why do we do this? It's to create more humane architecture. And that is that.
Thank you, Milton. Can you please stop sharing your screen so that we can see each other better?
There we are.
Okay. Yes. Well, we actually don't have the usual view of the owl today, but I don't worry about it because I actually think it works much better like this, and you can see me better. Thank you for this really wonderful lecture. I didn't want to interrupt you too much because I also noticed that the students were very focused, absorbing, and I was also absorbing all these threads. And I think it's very, very fortunate that you focused your presentation in this concept of essence as something to unravel all these other threads relating to the brain and to cognition and to how we can actually work with these concepts in architecture and design. And I had to think in connection with this topic of essence with another notion or another concept, the concept of authenticity, which is also something that really makes a difference between what we can say is the genuine work of art or work of architecture, and also related to building as a creature, one could also say, as something that is not just somehow put together, it's something that lives, that has this other quality, like you mentioned with the reference from Kant from the beginning, the immeasurable quality of something that somehow transcends the fact of being just material put together, but is somehow infused with a life of its own. And that's also this important quality that creates a resonance and that creates a connection to people and attracts people to bring this life. I also found it very interesting that you brought the topic of cubism in connection to it, because I actually did my master's on the topic of cubism, and it was in Czech Republic that it was the only place where cubism was applied in architecture. And they were very influenced by the German theories of aesthetics on empathy and so on, and they really tried to apply this plasticity in the context of building. And this is the reason why Frank Gehry did this very famous building in Prague with the dancing figures. So thank you also for bringing this up, because it triggered a lot of ideas. I also found it very interesting that you had this slide with the 3 images and how we respond to it. These 3 images in sequence, and I had to think the first one, love, and the second I stayed for some time, and then I thought, okay, it's an acquired taste, but that's how I felt about it. And I would be very curious to see different reactions to it. I would like to ask you, Milton, because I always try to bring this conversation somehow in a also a personal level. When was the moment that you started with your presentation by talking about also your interests in music and all these different disciplines, but what was the encounter you had with theories of neuroscience that triggered you about the potential to apply this in architecture and design?
Well, it was coming across, actually, I read a book by E.H. Gombrich called The Psychology of Art. That was my first contact with the subject. He talks about anticipation, tension, and release or conclusion. When you create artistic tension, what you're doing is you're creating something incomplete. You're creating something that has a trajectory towards something. You don't necessarily know what that is, but it lands. And in architecture, when you see a scene, there are ways that you look at things. You go through a space that's got a low ceiling, and then it becomes a high space. There is tension and release in that. If you go to a dramatic event, a play, typically it's 3 acts. First act sets the stage. The second act has a problem in it that isn't solved. The third act is the resolution. It's the same pattern. And I noticed that in art when I read Gombrich, and then I noticed it in music, very much in music. Music's all about creating tensions and then creating release. There's a book called Sweet Anticipation about music. Just substitute the word architecture for music through that book, and you'll find it's a wonderful, wonderful way to get deeper into this. So that's when I think it really worked for me, because I've been playing the piano at that point for about 15 years, and it just was like that. It was true. Looking for that in architecture is not as easy, and the reason is that we don't use that language with architecture. It doesn't mean because we don't use the language that it isn't there and powerful. Architecture is a 3-dimensional experience at the least, but it's a 4-dimensional experience in reality. And the dimension of time goes forward and goes backward and is all around us. So it's a very rich process. I would love to do a study with some of my neuroscience friends to talk about the kinds of events in architectural experience that are tension and release examples. That's what we manipulate as architects when we're self-conscious about that.
Milton, but I think what's also really interesting about all these discussions is that, and also through all these conversations we have been having, I still have the feeling that we, the architects, we in general, we are the ones who are most distracted to these qualities. I think that people who actually don't have to think about space, but use and live with space, perhaps take more time to feel about these qualities. But there's also very little dialogue happening with people. You also had the reference, this reference from the book Designing for People. And you also stressed this out, that it was necessary that in '68, I believe, someone writes a book saying, we are not talking to the people we're designing for. Why do you think this is happening?
I think one of the reasons is that architects' brain space is dominated by the process of making buildings, which is not emotive, particularly. There's deadlines and there's cost pressures. And so when architects get commissions, there's a rush to a conclusion. To a concept, rather, not a conclusion, but to a concept that can be presented to a client quickly. That shortens the attention to pre-design. It's a real fault in the profession. Pre-design that is qualitative, as opposed to how many square feet or square meters a space needs to have, that's qualitative about experience, brings you to a whole different outcome. And it doesn't necessarily take a lot of time. In my practice, I found ways to streamline that process so we could meet our clients' schedules and still do it. So it's possible to do it. But the other thing that architects don't do is post-occupancy analysis. We don't go back to our clients and the users and afterwards say it. I do that in my school projects regularly, from 4-year-olds through the teaching staff. Teresa, you have a question?
No, there.
I saw a hand up.
It was a hand. I also saw something, but I think it was maybe we had a fly or it was an involuntary movement. But you can already warm up questions. I still have a few threads to give to the conversation, but I really wanted to participate today. Yes, Milton, I absolutely agree that there's a lot of distractions, and I would say that because recently, in the last 3 years, I have been incorporating a lot this topic of waste in the design projects I'm doing with my students, because we know that we in architecture and design, we will have to work very differently in the future because of climate change and the whole way we will have to deal with the whole idea of building. So in the future, we will have, and not such a far away future, but maybe starting now, we will have to build less and work much more by transforming what's already there. So now talking to you, I actually started to feel very hopeful, because if we imagine that from now on, we will have to transform what's already there, that means that in some ways we will be released to think so much about problem and form and size and so on, and we will actually have a chance to focus on the qualities. Well, we will also have to enhance energy efficiency and make spaces more livable, increase green, all of these things we need to do. But since we already have something to work with, maybe there will be more time and more space to develop these qualities further. Also because if we understand also in terms of, and now there's much more discussions also in terms of politics and city management about the connection between well-being and stress in cities, and how this is also something that will have a very strong effect in the policy we make, and how we decide how we transform buildings to serve people's needs in a more profound way. So perhaps we will have a brighter future with more time to think about people.
I hope you're right. I think one of the things that I think makes this such an important topic for me, and you're talking about optimism, is architecture. I come to this subject as an architect, as I said at the very beginning, and there are not a lot of people in the profession of architecture who, although there are more and more all the time, who are bringing neuroscience into the pragmatic environment of practice. And because of that, I have a hard time sometimes talking with my colleagues about how to approach a project, including my teaching colleagues, who are, some of them are wizened old professionals and they don't want to change much. But the point that I keep making is, look at the most interesting buildings, look at the most fascinating buildings. What are the buildings that we do love? What are the emotions that they arouse in us? What's our human response to them? I think if you start with that, you start to open doors. And that's something I love doing as a practitioner and as a teacher, and as someone I don't think calling me a researcher isn't correct, but I am a kind of investigator and a translator of neuroscience into architecture. That's my passion. And I think that there's a future for it that is very rich and can be very accessible in the profession, and not something that's over there somewhere.
Yes, and many opportunities also to understand how we can transfer these qualities of the buildings that we really appreciate and that we feel that can really transform us and transport us into other states and of consciousness. How can we understand and work with these qualities to transform many of the buildings that we complain that are uninspired and uninspiring, and how can we infuse them also with some of those qualities?
What I hope we don't have is going through the process of designing buildings in a conventional way, and then at the end, painting on the affect. Oh, I want it to be warm, I'll make it orange. As opposed to starting with it and starting with how people actually experience the world.
So now it's your time for questions. We already have one candidate, and I really hope that the OWL will collaborate, because today it's being a little bit tricky.
Maybe it's gonna be just my voice, probably. Yes, but it's okay.
There was something here. Wait a moment.
Okay.
Okay, now it will work.
I hope that you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. So just a brief question about, like, I was thinking, how can you find a balance between your emotions and the client emotions in the pre-design process and in general through the whole process? Like, how can you manage to not let your emotions suffocate the client's needs and perceptions and something like that? I don't know.
It may be the most important ethical question in design, what you just raised. I make a very important distinction between what a client wants and feels and what the architect wants and feels. And the way I do it is I don't start with me, I start with them. It doesn't mean that I don't lead and I don't guide and I don't make suggestions. I do that all the time. But I also look for their aesthetic preferences, and they're also their personal goals and aspirations. When I work on, I've done a lot of schools. When I talk to students about their aspirations, they don't know how to translate that into architecture. That's my job. But if I'm not starting with their aspirations, how is it even possible that the building will fulfill them? How is it possible that the building will be the right tone to align with what helps them be satisfied and productive and happy in an environment? That's what I mean by humane architecture. There's a certain kindness in that. That's the word humane conveys kindness. And the architect's job, I think, is to be a helper to help people have better lives. And architecture is a means for that, one of many.
Thank you very much. It's a hard topic to handle anyway, so there's a lot of work to do, I guess.
There is.
Thank you. Next question. There's already another one coming. And we also have in the audience, we have Professor Tatiana Berger and we have Rulu. So maybe you will also like to make some comments. We're very happy that you're here.
Thank you, Maria, but I would like to let the students ask their questions first, and I'll hold my comments until later on. Thank you.
Thank you.
A few days ago, I had a very interesting discussion with other designers, actually, and about this certain feeling of dimensions and color combinations, and also the word taste, which is very hard topic. And we also find out that we always, it was a little mean maybe, but you always have those other students that are somehow always missing the point or don't have the right connection to their aesthetic or something. I mean, there are aesthetics that you don't really like, but you understand them and you accept them. But sometimes, yeah, some people don't have this feeling. And we were wondering if you can learn that, if you can learn and develop this taste. What do you think about this?
Are you talking about architects developing this taste? Or are you talking about clients? Who are you talking about?
About designers in general, okay. Yeah.
Like anything else, learning takes place over time and needs guidance.
Yeah.
If I bring you a problem, I'm basically asking a question. So as a teacher, I want you to focus on something in particular. And if I do that, and I teach a course in Washington called Beauty and Brains, and it's a constant pushing onto students of, they then push back and we refine and they become projects and they become discussions. And over the course of that time, I'm not trying to change their taste. And I think we could spend a couple hours talking about what taste is. I'm not trying to change it. What I'm trying to do is to give them a language to articulate it. And it just happens that if you articulate it, that you can get better at making and not just at responding. So for example, the love it, hate it slides that I put up.
Yeah.
I do that with my students a lot, but in that class I say, so now tell me why you love it or why you hate it. And we spend a good bit of time trying to dissect that. And what you find is very quickly is that it's very hard to come up with the words. It's very hard to go from the embodied emotional response to something that can be articulated. Very hard to do. And then it's even harder to take those kinds of positions or conclusions or affinities, that's probably the best word, to take those affinities and translate that into 2- and 3-dimensional results. And the way I have my students overcome that is not to try to solve the whole problem at once. I'm not quite answering your question about taste, but I'll come back to it. The way I have them do it is through thumbnail sketches. I just say, take a piece of paper and divide it into squares that are very small, and just start downloading fragments of images that are in your mind after you've begun to immerse yourself in what the project is. Then you're going to have the ability to see in graphic form or in model form. You can do it with clay, you can do it with pencil, you can do it with a pen, you can do it in all sorts of media. You start to get a sense of what it is that is in your mind that you can then articulate and develop further. So about taste. The neuroscience world infers a lot, and I agree with it, and I think it's an important topic. That although there are differences in people's taste, which I would just say is preference, there are differences in preference, that over a culture and sometimes across cultures, there's more agreement than there is disagreement about what people like and don't like.
Yeah, we were also agreeing on that.
Yeah, the evolutionary anthropology and evolutionary architecture looks for the things that we like in the environment that helped us survive. And there's a series of studies of landscape paintings that have certain elements in them that people gravitate toward and like, and very narrow examples of it because, very narrow examples that have these elements. Sunlight, verdant, that is lots of green, lots of growing things, water, and the ability to see at a distance from a protected position, otherwise referred to as refuge and prospect. If you have those elements present in a landscape painting, people like them much more than if they don't. And then I'll posit my pet theory about the sunlight part. I think that if you want to recognize at a distance whether something is friend or foe, whether it's something that could attack you or it's a food source, for example, or members of a tribe approaching you in ancient times and you don't know whether they're people that you have to defend yourself from or not. It's the shadows seen at a distance that give you information the most quickly. A lot of our underlying cognition, or perception rather, is black and white. Color is in many ways a secondary thing. So in architectural terms, we perceive buildings more rapidly in bright sunlight than in the shade. I've done some drawings to experiment with that my students and I discuss quite a bit. And I think that part of our reaction to that is a sense of beauty. Why? And beauty is just a word for liking something emotionally that is visual, or it could be auditory too. But it's a measure of deep like. So in the case of architecture, I would posit that the environment that was survival oriented, or the processes that were beneficial to survival, now reside in us eons later as preferences that we don't have an easy time describing, but really are perceptual and survival based, like liking things in bright sunlight. Dark is dangerous. Not being able to see at a distance clearly is dangerous. And we feel those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting.
But we might also be attracted to danger. We love we love horror movies, and we love exciting things. And there's also the element of the mysterious, that the brain wants to know what's on the other side, and that can trigger curiosity and also some kind of excitement. And also with the topic of taste, I would say that we can never underestimate how ugly things can also be very endearing and compelling.
Yeah.
And for example, Van Gogh's paintings, he was completely unsuccessful as an artist while he was alive. He couldn't sell one single painting, and now we all acknowledge that those paintings are wonderful.
Common aesthetics can change as well.
Exactly, and it's wonderful to keep also one sense of openness.
Yeah.
I'll tie this back to tension and release. So if I have something in front of me that prevents me from seeing a figure, then that's an obstacle. That's a tension, because my brain, Gestalt, is activated. My brain wants to to know what that thing is on the other side of this barrier. So that's tension. And in architecture, you can walk around it and there's release, because now I know, I can identify what it is. So in an environment that doesn't have everything plainly set out for you, architects can manipulate those environments in order to create obstacles and then release them. That's part of the dance, that's part of the choreography of architecture. If you look at tension and release in a painting, and anything two-dimensional, it's the fight against the frame. It's the pressure of a figure against a frame or against other figures. In the case of architecture, we can move. That's how architecture induces movement, because we don't have a fixed frame. We can move the frame. In the case of art, we want to have things in the center, but they're not often given to us in the center. Very few paintings are centered, have the figure centered. It's usually one way or another, okay? But we want to see it in the center because we can capture the most foveal information. So what happens in architecture? We can move something from here to there cognitively with our feet. Overcome the tension and create a solution.
Nice.
Yes. And also about taste, I had to think, I was thinking architecture building that could give an example, or the work of an architect, Antoni Gaudi in Barcelona, for example. It's very polarizing. There are people who absolutely love his architecture, and there are people who hate his architecture, and there are people who think they hate it because they see it from pictures, and when they experience it, they fall in love with it. I have met many different positions. I was curious. I wasn't particularly fond of it, but when I was there the first time, it really got me because of how it moved me physically.
I'll tell you one anecdote about taste. I had a client in the middle of America where things tend to be more conservative. And those clients came to me and said, we'd like you to design a house for us. This is a client who I designed a lot of schools for in Washington, but he had a house in Kansas. He said, I want you to help me build a Victorian house that is very old style with cylindrical spaces and pitched roofs and a really traditional vocabulary. And that's not what I typically did, but I was working with this client and trying to find solutions. So he and his wife and I would meet regularly, and I would bring them magazines with tabs and give them tabs and say, I want you to go through these magazines, and I want you to put a green tab on something you like and a red tag on something that you don't like, and then we'll talk about it. And we had lots of time. We took lots of time to talk about it. And they bought books and magazines, and they put tabs on them too. So it wasn't just coming from me. Over the course of several months of this conversation, it was no longer a Victorian house because they concluded that they wanted more open space. They didn't want a sense of heavy containment. They wanted more flow. They wanted more connection to nature. By the time the house was designed, it was a lot of glass and a lot of open space. And the site contributed to that being the right solution, but also their attitudes. Their attitudes didn't change, but the way they manifested those attitudes and preferences that they were willing to pay for did change through the course of our discussions. When we were done with that process, I don't think they felt like I imposed anything on them. I led the translation into architecture of the things that we together realized that they valued the most. They established the hierarchy.
Great
Thank
example. Thank you. So, more questions? No? Okay, I think we don't have any more questions from here, or maybe they need a little more time to think. So I would like to ask in the audience if there would be a question or a comment. Tatiana, we can't hear you. I think you're still muted. Tatiana,
Sorry
maybe
about that. Yes,
maybe
I was on mute.
you could introduce yourself.
Well, sure, but it's actually all here in my title. If you look at the screen. So I'm Professor Tatiana Berger. I teach architecture and urban design in California, and these days really all over the world online. I'm also on the ANFA Advisory Council and currently the liaison for education for ANFA, the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. And it's just so wonderful to be here with all of you. I'd like to thank Milton for the very thoughtful and inspiring lecture. Thank you, Milton. It really is helping me to think through a lot of important issues. And I want to thank Maria, of course, for continuing to run these wonderful discussions now for many, many months. They're always inspiring. And thank you to the students as well. So I appreciate, Milton, the discussion about pre-design. And I think that, one of the ills that we've been finding, of course, over the last years is this focus on the concept, right? What is this idea of the concept, which is so reductive when we are asked to reduce all of our ideas and feelings about a work of architecture to, sometimes in schools, is to a single idea. And we know that this is impossible, right? So I appreciate the focus on thinking about pre-design and conversation. And architecture is not an art or an aesthetic object only. We can never reduce it to an object or a concept. It is actually the design of narratives for human actions, behavior, and feelings, right? It's really the design of narratives. So we need to ask ourselves, how can we now develop the tools and strategies for design education, but also for a new design practice that will help us to empathize with our clients and to understand much more deeply the kinds of narratives that we need to design, right? Again, for action and behavior and feeling. And so if we put the question that way, then we realize that we need to transform completely the way that we design. And a lot of it will happen in these initial stages. We need to introduce much more research in the design process, and of course, conversation and empathy. And somebody who did this actually quite well was Richard Neutra, right? Richard
Yes.
Neutra, who wrote Survival by Design, right? And he worked with his clients very deeply in conversation and interviewed each one for hours, sometimes for weeks, to understand what was needed. So I guess I wanted to ask Milton, how do you believe we can best develop these new strategies, both for design education and our practice, to help us to create such narratives?
It's a perfect question. I think one of the reasons that we have a problem that needs solving in the first place is that there's a kind of conflict between what architects generally love, which is the sculptural qualities of buildings. We love things that tend toward the aggressive in architecture, because we love that sculptural tension. I think we have parts of our brain that get endorphins more quickly in dealing with that. So there's a tendency to go right to that. And in terms of trying to get us to use pre-design in a more qualitative and emotive related way, I think it's important to discourage the kind of practices that you are concerned about, and I am concerned about, to help architects find that there are better ways to do things. So I talk at National AIA, this is the American Institute of Architecture, architects conferences and regional conferences. And I find that architects are actually quite hungry for ways to do things that are not based on what we'll call formal manipulation, to start with making aggressive forms or dynamic forms, or making the form the thing, or really abstracting things and doing a partie, a diagram that is a plan-only diagram, or perhaps it's a section diagram, but it's really a diagram that you can't inhabit. You can't place yourself in it to understand whether what you're doing is on the right track or not. So I find there's a lot of hunger in the profession, because there's a lot of sort of gut level recognition by architects that I've found very sincerely that we know we're not doing it right. There's a strong sensibility about that, but then we're frustrated because we have clients that have demands for speed, demands for a lot of things, and we get distracted from that. It's the creation of empathy. In my school projects, it was always empathy first. I had a relationship with my clients, with the directors, with the students, with the teachers, with the parents, and they knew that I was sincerely interested in what they were about. And that was authentic, to use the term that Maria used earlier. It's authentic because that's the way I feel about it, and that's the way I've pursued my career. But I think there's a tendency to want to go for I think I understand what you mean by concept, Tatiana, to go for something that is graphically concise, but not experiential.
Well, absolutely. And it's interesting that you bring up graphics, because, I have felt for a long time that we're really lacking not only the means of communication about this important transformation that has to take place. That's why we're all here. And thank you to the students as well. But we're really missing the tools for graphic representation of this new empathetic relationship to help us create the narratives, right? Even when you speak about cubism, Milton, when you speak about the idea of dynamic experience and multiple perspectives that all users, all inhabitants of built spaces have, right? We each have our own perspective, our own set of feelings and perceptions of architecture. So architects need to really learn how to predict, in a sense. I think we can use that word, predict, and the best architects know how to do this, but how to predict how people might move through spaces and experience spaces. And of course, drawings graphics, diagrams, mapping. These are the tools that can help us to do all of this in that pre-design stage and in the early, really all through the design. So at the moment, you know, unless we speak about virtual reality, we might argue that we are missing the tools for graphic representation to help us understand human experience of space. And if anybody would like to respond, or maybe you have an idea that, well, yes, you know, I've tried these kinds of drawings and they've been successful, please jump in. But the idea of graphic representation for dynamic experience and for perceptual experience is incredibly important. We are sometimes limited by the types of representations that we have been taught or that we can produce.
You know, there's a phrase I've heard and I like that is, all media lie. They just lie differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a student a few years ago who at the jury brought in a large monitor and gave the jurors VR glasses, and he walked us through his project. Now, we say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, if that's the case, something that is animated, that you can actually pass through the spaces and get some kinesthetic feeling or kinesthetic experience out of that, is worth 1 trillion words. Now, does it get you to the point of simulating the actual experience that people will have? No, we haven't gotten there. And I don't know that we ever will, but perhaps we will. But we know already that elevation drawings don't get you there. We know that plan drawings certainly don't get you there. Perspective sketches that are done with a single point of view get you some. Animation gets you some. And the more reality, the verisimilitude, the closer the depiction is to what will actually be experienced, the better. What I think is really ultimately missing is the tactile sense of spaces. You know, there's that wonderful classic by Rasmussen, Experiencing Architecture. He talks about all the other senses. So I had my students one time design a house for a blind composer. We took vision away. And so they had to design based on a specific composer and a specific work. When you do that, you start to realize that the formal representation of architecture may be a long way from the experiential realities of it. And that particular project taught me an enormous amount.
That's right. Yes, completely agree. And I would encourage, you know, all the students listening today and others who will tune in later and see the recordings to really begin to design their own design process. Think just for a moment, how would you like to do that, right? How can you design the process? How can you invent new ways of representing space to help you capture and predict human experience, and especially dynamic experience, right? Time is essential. We know in the experience of architecture, we never perceive architecture as a single image, as you might see on, you know, Archinect or in a fancy glossy magazine. That's not architecture. That's architecture reduced to an object and to a concept. But we can do much better, right? So this is where we begin to understand our ethical responsibility as architects, because architecture has the power to transform us, to transform our brain, to transform our daily life, and to contribute to well-being, really to physical and emotional and spiritual health, right? So I think we need to begin there, that we have an ethical responsibility because we are responsible for the health of individuals and communities.
Actually, you know, I think that ethical issue is really important. Every time an architect has a commission and does a building, you take away all the opportunities to do it a different way. You get that one shot at it, and that client is invested in getting that one attempt to get it right. So the ethical responsibility is very, very large to get it right. That's one thing. The second thing, Tatiana, when you talked about looking at renderings in magazines or photographs, that really goes to the principle of permeability. Those are very opaque. They're very hard. And when you look at them, you just feel like, you know, it's pushing me away. It's not drawing me in at all. Photographs just don't draw you in. And that goes to the issue of permeability. The medium that doesn't have permeability for me is one that doesn't even bring you close to understanding what the experience will be.
Thank you, Tatiana. Really wonderful that you're here. And I also want again to say thank you to Tatiana for bringing me to the ACE network, for creating this wonderful network of educators of ANFA, which allowed all of these conversations to happen. And she's here with us today. We need to finish very soon, but there was just one more question or comment from Rulu that I would like to take, and then we have to finish, because our students are already, some of them leaving.
Yeah, so I would only like to make a small comment about, maybe in the sense that Tatiana was speaking, architects tend to take examples of places or buildings that are famous in some way, but we often forget to pay attention to the buildings we actually inhabit most of the time. So in that sense, I would encourage people to maybe go closer to the streets and the houses and the routes that we actually live in, instead of focusing in even though if it's important, but maybe in that sense we can come closer to actual communication with the persons that inhabit spaces by taking it seriously, to experience houses, our own houses, to re-experience them in a conscious way. So I know there's not enough time, but that's what I.
No, it's a great comment. I'll just briefly respond that when I was teaching the first year students, and I actually did a version of it later on, but with my first year students who had a lot of experience with non-monumental buildings, they grew up in houses, they went to schools, but let's take the houses for scale. I would ask them to draw plans of their houses from memory, which meant they had to translate a concrete kind of experience into something that was an abstraction, which is an important process for architects to be able to do that. Then I said, take some colored pencils and I want you to mark on these plans where in the house you like to be and where you didn't like to be. And then we talked about it. It was revolutionary in my thinking, in my understanding, to hear students who at that point had 17 or 18 years experience in the environment. They're not a blank slate, they're not a tabula rasa, to be able to share things that help them understand better what architecture was about, but also for me to understand much better what architecture was about. It was a transformational experience for me to have them report.
Yeah, and often we forget that when we go through our practice, we grow a part of that sense, and we go near the most historical and important places, and we often forget the memories of our common places.
So if it's true that people spend 90% of their time in buildings, I think it's a little high, but a lot, what percentage of that time is spent in buildings that are considered significant architecture, whatever that means?
Yeah.
The answer is that much.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to Tatiana's concern about ethics. What is the good we should be doing that we're not doing?
I think that's where we need to start, right? That's the big idea here. And I really want to challenge every student to think about, you know, why are you training to be an architect or a designer? What would you like to achieve? What's your ultimate goal? So start there. I like to think of architects almost like doctors, right? Architecture could be considered a kind of preventive medicine, because we know that we can make a huge impact in people's lives, and not just day to day, not just in a single moment in how we experience, but we know from neuroscience, you know, I'm sitting here in sunny San Diego, California. So hello from San Diego. And 10 minutes away from me is Salk Institute, which is the famous institute where people are, making discoveries. And someone like Fred Gage, who studies, right, neurogenesis. And we now have facts. We now know that our brain is changing constantly. And guess what has a huge impact on our brain? Not just in one moment, but over time. And that is our built environment, right? And this is also what Milton was speaking about. So as soon as we realize that our built environment actually impacts us really for our entire life and impacts our health, then the next thing we need to consider is what is that ethical responsibility that we have as designers to improve people's lives. So this is, a much larger conversation, a much richer conversation than just about what the building looks like, what we've all sort of been taught to do. I went to schools in the United States, some of the best schools, and this is how we were taught. We were taught to appreciate architecture and to create it as an aesthetic object, the way that it looks, right? And maybe some of you as well. So we need to really reorganize our priorities now and realize the power of the impact that we can make.
Thank you, Tatiana. We will have to finish from now because we are already a little bit over time. So thank you again, Milton, for this really inspiring lecture. Always so interesting and fluid conversation. And I also specifically want to say again, thank you to Milton, because Milton has been present in every session of the cycles of conversations on corporeal architecture, from the first one to this one. So many conversations, and your contributions are really inspiring and meaningful. Thank you very much.
It's always my pleasure, Maria.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for being here, and until next time, bye-bye.
Yeah.